Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. We're running this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are in the world. This webinar is introducing the NEC4 Facilities Management Contract, an exciting new development by NEC, working in conjunction with IWFM, developing a new contract form specifically targeting the FM sector. And in today's webinar, I'm going to give you some background to that contract, explain why we've produced it and what the contract contains, and highlight some of its key features. In terms of housekeeping for today's session, if you can keep any questions to the end, please. If you do have any questions, please either type the question in full into the chat function, or else state your name and that you have a question, and then I will turn to those questions after we've been through the presentation. Can I also request that if you're not speaking, use your microphones, so avoid any background noise or interference. Also, can I ask you don't take control or try to take control of the slide deck. Let the presenters drive it. That way you'll get the best experience from the session. The session is being recorded, and so you will be able to get access to it after the session is complete. We'll make that available via the NEC website in the next day or so. And also, with the questions themselves, if we don't get time to answer all of your questions, we shall put together a note that will follow on the back of the session, giving our responses to any questions that have remained unanswered. So by way of introduction, my name is Ian Heafy. I'm a member of the NEC4 Contract Board, and I'll be hosting the session today. My two fellow presenters will now introduce themselves and give some background to who they are, starting with Chris, please.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Jeffers. I'm a Facilities Management Consultancy Director at Mott MacDonald, where I've been for getting on for about 2 years now. For those of you that don't know, Mott MacDonald is a global engineering, construction and advisory business. And we have quite a long track record of using and advocating the use of NEC in the various formats of contract, to the extent that we have an in-house team of trainers led by my colleague Richard Patterson. So a lot of experience and a lot of good news stories in the NEC space. I've worked for a number of consultancies over the last 15 or so years. Prior to that, I've held a variety of roles in commercial and property management, predominantly with a focus on FM, facilities management. I'm a fellow of RICS. I'm a chartered FM facilities management surveyor. I'm also a fellow of IWFM. I've been a member of IWFM for about 15 or so years now, supported a range of initiatives whilst I've been a member of IWFM, including the support to Grenfell disaster and some of the development work around the building safety manager. I'm the immediate past chair of the procurement special interest group for IWFM, and I was the steering group lead for this work with NEC. Real pleasure to be with you all today.
Thank you, Chris. Ross?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ross Hayes. I'm an independent consultant, and I've been working with the NEC ever since it was first started, really. I'm particularly involved with the drafting of and working with the term service contracts, and was one of the NEC4 drafters, and have been one of the drafters for this particular contract, and work now with mainly training and occasional consultancy advice for various clients. It's me.
Thank you, Ross. Okay, so in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to look firstly at what are the new FM contracts, how they are, what we've produced, how they fit together. We'll then look at why we need these new forms of contract, why were they produced, look at some of the key elements of the contracts, and then look at next steps around how we're going to develop the contracts themselves, supporting documentation, roll those out to a wider audience, and then we should have 20 to 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So I'll hand over to Chris to take us through the first part of the presentation.
Super, thank you, Ian. Yes, so it's my job to set a bit of a context really in terms of why these contracts have been put together, a little bit about the context of the FM market and why we think NEC is a good fit. So just before I start, a couple of tiny little bit of housekeeping things for me. I do have a bit of a connection issue, so I'm just about to switch my camera off because I think you'd probably rather hear me rather than see me. I will turn it back on for the Q&A sessions a little bit later. And the other thing to mention, I'm sorry to sort of bring this up as it were, but I do have some home learning, homeschooling going on. or not, as it may be. So if you do hear any noise in the background, I apologise. Trying to keep it to a minimum. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. So what exactly is being provided here with this new contract version, the NEC4 facilities management contracts? I think probably the first thing to be clear on is this is very much a part of the NEC family of contracts, with the structures, the processes, procedures that come with that. But that we have looked to develop this with a focus on what the FM sector needs. We've looked to align some of the key benefits of NEC, such as the focus on good management, collaboration, with how this can work, how this should work for FM practitioners. And I'll touch on this again in a minute or two. Who do I mean by we? Well, NEC's worked with IWFM, the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management, on developing these contracts. So I represent IWFM here today, and with colleagues from the IWFM steering group set up to support this work, we worked with NEC to produce what we feel is a real positive step in the right direction for FM contracting, both in the UK and overseas. No industry stands idle. Change and improvement are ever-present factors for most of us. And it's particularly true for FM, which is a relatively young industry, if not in what it does and how it supports organisations, because that's always happened and always been important, but certainly in how it has become recognised, perhaps no more so than the last 12 months. With this new contract suite, we've tried to ensure the format is accessible and user-friendly as possible to a sector that's not been well represented in contract form historically. I know there have been other forms of contract in this space, and indeed I've used them over the years, but there isn't anything else that's quite in the position as NEC at this point. So we've updated terminology and processes to ensure they are up to date and as much as they can be, and also reflected on how practitioners are able to pick up the contract and use it, notwithstanding that some degree of how NEC contracts work is needed, and I might touch on that a little bit later if we have time. So to confirm, we have two new contracts currently in a pre-publication edition, the FM contract and the FM subcontract, and of course the user guides to support these, which have been reviewed and revised to reflect the FM industry, including FM specific examples to aid understanding and learning. For those of you that are perhaps not as familiar, just as a gentle reminder, the user guides cover such areas as preparing an NEC FM contract, managing the contract in use, as well as the more strategic focused, establishing a procurement and contract strategy, and selecting a supplier. So we strongly recommend that these user guides are read and probably then read again, but there always needs to be an element of practical training as well, if one has not had that in the past, if one is new to NEC. It's not just major multi-million-pound deals with multiple locations or different regions, etc. The full contract suite will be provided and be available for use after the full publication, including the short form for agreements that are simpler in structure, have less risk, usually for lower values. So the new form of contract can be used for one service, one building, just as much for the larger agreements that we also see in the FM markets. Okay, so going on then in terms of how do we get here for this contract and why they need it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the important thing, I suppose, remember, we just want to take a moment just to sort of set this work and the contract suite in context. I'm conscious that we have a wide range of listeners tuning into this webinar today, some of whom will be very familiar with FM and perhaps NEC as well, but others perhaps less so. So why do we need them and why are they an important development for FM? Well, perhaps the first thing to note here is that the FM sector does not have a commonly accepted and up-to-date, standalone, clearly identifiable form of contracts until now. And given the size of the sector and the numbers of people that work in it, we believe this is sorely needed. And this is not just our professional opinion. We've heard this a lot over the years, whether it's with working with client organisations, or whether it's the industry forums that we've attended or anecdotal conversation, the need for a set of terms that recognises FM, I think, is really important. And whilst it's difficult and probably not, I would say perhaps not really necessary to accurately value the FM market in the UK, there are several sources that you can find and quite easily research that quote this as being in the region of about 100 billion in 2020. So whether that's 95 billion or 110 billion, it's significant and it's of real value. Due to the nature of what FM services are, that is the core supporting services that will always be needed by organisations, there has been a tendency in the past to view FM as possibly recession proof, not so vulnerable to economic downturns as other sectors. I'm not completely convinced on this, perhaps that's another conversation, but it is true to say that FM is more of a recognised and hopefully appreciated service now than it has ever been. And without doubt, it adds value to a business when done properly. Also, in terms of timing,
it's on an email.
Okay. Hi, Chris. Are you still there? We may have lost you, I'm afraid.
I am. I think I'm back. Am I back?
Yes, yes, you're back. Yes.
Sorry, yes.
Yes,
it was muted for
continue.
some reason. Apologies. I'll just start at the top of the of where we are around the ISO standard. I think it might have been lost there. So I was just talking about the in terms of the timing of this contract and the coming of age, if you like, is the fact that the industry now has a globally recognised and accessible ISO standard for facilities management in the form of ISO 41011. And in developing this new suite, we've attempted to use some of the language from the ISO standard. Not every element is present at this time, but the contract as it's developed has been very cognizant of it. If we have the time at the end of the presentation, perhaps we can explore this a bit more. But suffice to say at this point that the ISO standard took many years of hard work and concerted efforts from industry experts across the globe to develop and finalise. And it provides a common understanding around some of the key elements of FM strategy and service delivery. And we want to see more mention of the standards in contract specs and specifications and documentation in the future as the awareness of them grows. So greater understanding, consistency, raising standards of delivery, raising expectations of what good looks like. And it all needs a clearly understood contract form to support it. There's a trend in FM markets, not just in the UK, but in other regions as well, just now for larger in terms of size and scale, and in terms of value, agreements for FM services, often on an integrated basis. So again, for those that are new to us, a balance of hard and soft engineering services and cleaning and security, etc. in both public and private sectors. In the UK, the last few years has seen the end of any new PFI deals as we know them, but something will be needed in their place in the future, and it will be a great benefit for the parties involved, particularly when one considers the complexity of some of those deals, to be able to use a common form of contract that clearly sets out roles and responsibilities and promotes transparent communications and good management practices. So we see the adoption of a common form of contract as a route to strengthening FM standing and raising confidence, and in doing so going some way to mitigating risk in an industry that traditionally has been more adversarial than collaborative. Not alone in that, I know, but something that FM has certainly experienced in the past. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, NEC already produces a contract form that was specifically created to respond to the need for a more service-based contract and a service that's delivered over time, which may change as FM contracts are so often likely to do. The term service contract, the TSC, has been used for FM contract requirements. And there are some really good examples of where the TSC has proven a real success in providing the contractual basis for FM service delivery. But there are elements of the TSC that remain construction based. Some of the terminology is not, shall we say, FM friendly. And I think it probably also fair to say that there's been a view in the industry that whilst the TSC was a step in the right direction, it still did not accurately reflect the needs of FM, particularly when one considers where FM may go in the future. So this new contract suite has been developed with the support and guidance of FM practitioners and tailored to work specifically for FM user requirements. It is, as I mentioned a few minutes before, it is still predominantly an NEC contract, of course, and so understanding of how the NEC contract works, how it's structured, how the different elements of the contract relate to each other is essential. But this is important to know for any form of contract, and a wide range of training and guidance is available in support of NEC and will be so for this form of contract. I think I've already touched on as well that FM is such a wide and varied industry in terms of service requirements, geography, complexity, end user needs. But this is where we feel the NEC format should be well suited, as it is a format that can flex and adjust accordingly, including over the, as would be needed over the life of the contract. Mechanisms such as early warning notices, giving a heads up of the potential impact of an anticipated change, and compensation events, perhaps, stick my neck out here, might get some comments on this, perhaps not well understood in FM, give the parties the ability to flex and change as needed. So these terms remain in the drafting. The user guides have more supporting explanation of these, as hopefully you would expect, and we're looking to produce a number of practice notes and guidance notes to support the FM contract suite. And at least one of these will be on these areas that have been of difficulty in the past to FM practitioners to how to use the NEC suite. We recognise that and we know that. So such as compensation events, defined cost, etc., to help explain these in an FM context, and we'll give some working examples in those documents. So I've stated, I'm probably overstating, the need for knowledge and understanding of NEC is important for the successful application and use of this contract suite. But for the time and commitment given to do so, the positives to users are many, such as the clarity, the more certainty in procurements, tender exercises, and then the subsequent contract management of the agreements. Our markets, not alone, but certainly our markets do face an uncertain future. The labour market, the workplace paradigm shifts, where work is delivered, how it's delivered, what the expectations of clients will be, the overlay of technology, etc. But FM provides a vital support pillar to a successful business. I'm a strong advocate of that, and I know many of my colleagues are. So we feel it needs a stability and certainty in the contracting environment so that it can really demonstrate the value it can bring. The FM market has for some time mooted the idea of contractual outcomes rather than outputs, again something I'm a strong advocate of, and this would be a real step change, I believe, to move us away from what has traditionally been more of a purely contractual customer provider position towards more of a partnership, or at least two parties moving towards common goals and common objectives. But this can only happen if the terms by which the parties engage are clearly understood, transparent, and again, sticking my neck out a bit, the parties trust each other to do what is required of them under the contract. We think NEC can provide the platform to achieve this. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview as to the context and why IWFM has supported this and some of the supporting work we've been doing over the development of these contract documents. So we now move on to the second part of our webinar this afternoon, and I'll hand you over to Ross to take us through some of the key elements of the contract documents themselves. Over to you, Ross.
Thank you very much, Chris. and I'm aware very much that I am, in a sense, talking to both people who understand the NEC term service contract background and for those who are new to the NEC world as well. So in a sense, this is going to match both of them. I would also like to say, to re-emphasize some of Chris's points, that this is still an NEC contract. So that has its virtues of being, for example, international, so it can work across national boundaries. It has the advantage of being very flexible. It has the, one might almost say, the downside of being infinitely variable and therefore requires work putting it together, just like any other contract might, in this case, for an NEC term contract, or in this case, an FM contract. So what I want to go through is very briefly is just through a few points. Some of you may have heard some of these before, but a few points here to explain the differences, in one sense, the differences between this and a term contract, but also to do it from a FM perspective, to try and demonstrate what it is that has been brought into the contract that reflects how the FM sector works. And there's just 5 points here, which I'm just going to pick up in due course, picking up changes to the language, as Chris has already intimated, particularly bringing in a new core procedure for service orders, bringing it into the core part of the contract so it's available to all the contracts. As you will know, the NEC has an approach whereby there are optional extras that you can bring in to suit the way you want to run your contract strategy. And in some cases they're in core, in some cases they're an option, and this is a core one. And then we've also brought in other procedures and requirements to reflect the FM sector. We've moved some of the core procedures that were in the old contract into an optional section on the basis they're not, generally speaking, always needed by the FM sector. But we've also done the opposite. We brought certain things in which were sort of optional choices, particularly on the incentivization you might want to bring in. We brought that into the heart of the contract because it's at the heart of the way the FM sector works. And then we've done a few bits of pieces about changing the contract to reflect new practices that have come into place even in the last few years. So next slide, please. Just a very brief one, but it sounds silly in a sense, but it was at the heart of some of the resistance that we've had in other contracts. The industry talks about service providers rather than contractors. It doesn't want it to be so construction orientated in its language. So we've moved to that when we have service providers. The contract talks about the old term service contract used the concept of tasks and task orders. The industry tends to talk about projects. If it has extra work it wants to do that is programmable and is important, it talks about taking on projects, and we've moved it to projects and project orders. I'll explain these all in a moment or two. And the last one, in a sense, on the screen here is we're talking about service failures and not defects. The construction world tends to talk about a defect, something that is wrong that needs putting right. But in the FM world, that isn't always the case. First of all, you can't always put it right. But secondly, it's essentially a failure to provide a service at a level that you've asked for. And that's why we've changed the language there. And whilst those seem very, the changes, why we bothered to change the language, the reality is we're trying to relate to the language that the sector uses. Next slide, if I may. This, I think, is at the heart of the aspect of the changes. We brought in something called a service order. Now, the industry is used to the concept of call-off type orders, particularly on reactive type maintenance work. I want something, I know what it is I want to do, but I just don't quite know when I may need it to be done. And that has always been possible to run in the old forms of contract, but you had to set it all up. In this case, we've got the hook called a service order built into it. And it's and in a sense, the service order is easy. This is what I'd like you to do. What is more difficult is, well, how do I want it done? How can I order it? How can I instruct it? What is the part of the service I might want? And this is all put in the service order requirements. How the work is ordered and how the work is managed is in that information. How are we going to pay for it in terms of, is it as a comprehensive or semi-comprehensive type payment mechanism? What does the service provider have to do if they get to the job and find it's not what was first specified? So the variation of that instruction is built into the service order requirements. it doesn't take long to realize that this is a core fundamental document, which is going to be different for each type of service, different for each type of client. And that's why, in a sense, we can specify what goes into it, or we can give guidance on what goes into it, but it'll be different for every client. Next slide, please. We've brought in things into the core clauses. We brought in mobilisation and demobilisation plans. Those are, in fact, the language terms we all use, but they're also the language terms that are in that ISO guide we heard about beforehand. So we brought in those terms into core because they're always being used, including the updating of a demobilisation plan through the lifetime of the contract. We've brought design into the option clauses. Those of you who know the contracts, NEC contracts well, would recognise it from the X15 clause from the ECC. But it's a recognition that very often there may be work that is asked of the service provider that requires a design element, and how are we going to manage that design element, and where's the liability for it, and how is it being handled. So that's been brought in, again, as an optional clause because there may be no design required by the client, and therefore why clutter the contract with it. One of the concerns that many of the FM clients have got is the element of change of control, when the service provider may be taken over or has their control of that organisation moves from one party to another, and that second party may be one that the client doesn't want involved in their work. So there's the ability to step out of the contract if the change of control of the service provider is not acceptable. Next slide, please. Now, there's some of you here that are going to chuckle at this. We've moved project orders into the options, just as they were in the NEC4 clauses. But because we brought into the main core clauses the service orders, the call-off type work through call centres, which is so much at the heart of most FM work, we moved the project orders into the option clauses. If you don't want to have that sort of work being done by your service provider, and you may well not, then you don't need to bring it into the contract. On the other hand, we've swapped over and brought back into the core part of the contract the whole mechanism for measuring performance and the responses to that performance. In the term service contract, they were optional. You might bring in key performance indicators, you might not. You might bring in some sort of performance damage, or you might not. But in this case, we've brought it all into the main core center section through what's called a performance table, and into that you will specify what it is that you as a client want, what the requirements, the targets that you're looking for, and what you're going to do about it if those targets aren't met or are met to excess. What's the way you're going to either reward or not reward for achieving or not achieving those targets. So again, a bit like the service order requirements, the performance table will be a really core document in the contract and requiring a considerable amount of thinking about. We've modified a few procedures. We've talked about service failures already as a change of language, but we've also had to recognise the fact that some service failures can't be corrected. If I've got a service requirement that you, take a fairly trivial example, empty a waste paper basket by 7:30 in the morning and it hasn't been emptied, yes, I can go and empty it and correct that part of the service, but I cannot do it before 7:30 because 7:30 has passed. And that is a key sort of requirement often in many contracts. And how are we going to handle that? Well, we handled it in the mechanism for the service failures themselves, and clearly the mechanism for what is the impact of that would normally be routed through a performance table. As a much smaller point, we've brought together the ultimate holding company, parent company guarantee for many of you. The performance bonds were two different options. They've been brought into one so the client can choose which of those is appropriate. And as the last point on the screen there, just as a small point, it has quite a significant impact, and it's something that people may want to think through as we come into the contracts themselves. But we've changed the default position of who insures the affected property. Now that's the property that the asset the client has, their buildings, their assets they're looking after, the service providers looking after. And we've moved the responsibility for insuring that from this what was the contractor, now the service provider, to the client. So the client insures their own property unless they choose not to. We've given the ability to alter it and make and transfer that insurance responsibility and liability responsibility better to the service provider, but it starts as a default. It remains with the client where it first was. And that's something that, again, guidance may be wanted on, but it's something that people need to be aware of. Next slide. So the last slide I want to look at is where next. What we're going to do next? We've talked a little bit about how we got here. We've talked a little bit about some of the changes, and that is a fairly short and very quick oversight of some of the key changes. But where are we going to next? The next slide shows that. As we know, we're in a pre-launch meeting webinar now. Tomorrow we will be issuing the FM contract itself. This is only part of the whole bundle of 4 contracts: the contract, the subcontract, and then the 2 short forms. The bundle with the contract and the subcontract and all the user guides that have been done will be going out for Thursday, the 11th of February, in a couple of weeks' time. Now, those user guides are important. They're the standard NEC user guides, but they've been increased significantly by a lot more detail being put into them for the FM sector. But it's general information which relates to the widest use of that. So that's why we're also putting out practice notes and beginning to develop them. And with IWFM, we'll be developing a number of more. And that's the difference between what's going out tomorrow and what is going out in June. In June, the whole bundle, the whole package, short contracts, short subcontracts, and more of the guidance notes will all be developed and out and issued in June. And that's effectively the difference between the pre-production launch today and the main publication planned for later this summer. The NEC has always provided training in all their contracts. This is no different, and in fact the introduction to the FM contract is already available, or it's already in its final stages of development and will be available very soon, and we're hoping to have public courses available by the beginning of March. And then the last thing is we've set up a dedicated email address. Clearly, anybody can always email into the NEC for help, advice, but we're going to set up a particular one for the FM sector. So people who are asking questions, thinking about using it, just want a quick response to a comment, we can divert those directly into a dedicated email address for comments and questions, and you can see that on the screen in front of you. So that's the next steps of where we're going and what we're trying to do. And I think at this stage, the next slide, this is where I pass the control back over to Ian to lead us in a Q&A session. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, well, thank you, Ross and Chris, for that very informative presentation, giving us the background and detail of the contracts. We'll now open the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, please type them directly into the chat function, or else state you have a question to ask, and I will turn to yourselves at a suitable point in time and ask you to speak and give your question. There's a couple that have come through already, but just before we get to those, if I could ask maybe a question just to get the ball rolling. In terms of the contract and how it works, how does it deal with some of the local issues you may find, such as TUPE, and also some of the agendas people have in different parts of the world around net zero carbon, around social value? How are those going to be addressed in the contract or in supporting documentation? Chris, could you give us a view on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really important thing for us to consider, Ian, actually, in terms of how we've supported the development of this contract, the suite of contracts. We have been very mindful that items such as you've mentioned there are key issues within FM, and something that has been challenging to get into existing forms of contract. So how could we deal with this in these forms of contract? And we looked at different ways of doing this. We looked at, could you put them into the core clauses? Difficult to do so because you don't always need them. Historically, within the TSC form, they would have possibly been used via the Z clauses, been put in there via Z clauses. Not the best way of dealing with it, because they are so important depending on where you are in the world, such as TUPE. TUPE is a good example in the sense that the protection of provisions, in terms of people's employment contracts, so labour agreements, is not necessarily UK specific at all, but of course E2P is a UK legislation. So we've had to think about how to manage that, and I think the flexibility that the document suites of NEC provides allows us to do this. We know that there needs to be a clear direction, a clear steer for the industry and how this needs to be applied and how these issues need to be addressed, social value being another one. How can that be procured? What's the sort of the good practice approach to understanding what that looks like? So we are very committed to producing supporting documentation around whether it's a practice note or a guidance note, depending on whether it's UK based or not, for those issues, for those areas of work that needs to be. One of the things that I think is a real positive development of this contract suite. So supporting documentation is forthcoming as to how that will be applied. Ross, is there anything else that you would want to add in terms of where those issues would sit within the actual structure of the contract?
Some of them will inevitably, as one of the speakers said, will inevitably have to fit into the contract clauses through a Z clause, if you like. And the difficulty of writing those for ourselves, if you like, has always been, and 2P is a good example. Writing a 2P clause is fraught with problems because whatever is written, if you like, centrally, somebody else might want to go and change. We can give guidance on what they're supposed to be, but essentially we're talking about a legal issue, and some of these are legal issues, and the various different parties, clients want to write their own. We can give guidance, we give them assistance. Other things, though, are can be a bit more detail, for example, on the way you might want to deal with small and medium-sized enterprises, picking up the way that you might want to emphasize the encouragement of those, and how it's picked up would be part of the scope and part of the specification. So that's a particular way of picking that up, and the way it might want to work. So I think it's a lot will come through these guidance notes, but we've got to be fairly careful when we're giving various bits of guidance of not veering into an area where actually whatever we write, somebody will disagree with it.
Okay, thank you for that. Just turning to some of the questions we got through, and maybe this is a bit of a linked question to the previous one. How are issues around local environment, local legislation going to be integrated into the contract?
Yeah, I think I saw that come up in the chat. I think that's a similar aspect, that if you have specific requirements specific to your region, to the area that you're operating in, and of course if it's a multi-region contract, then those will change across the same framework contract, then that would need to be stipulated in within the scope, within those within the service requirements that you have. So if I think I understand the question right, then it absolutely can flex for different local requirements. You would have to set that out in terms of how you structure and build the contract, but I think NEC is quite well suited to that. Ross, hopefully you would concur with that in terms of
no, I would agree with that entirely. I think the more complex the structure of the work that's been going on, then the more care needs to be taken to look at these sort of issues fairly. I mean, it's a self-evident truth, I suppose, but if you're just running a fairly straightforward FM contract that's only going to work in the southeast of England, for example, then you've got a certain fairly well-defined framework of what it is you're looking for. If, on the other hand, you're trying to run a massive multi-work stream total FM contract across the whole of Europe, then you're going to be able to do it, but it's going to take a lot more thinking through to decide what is the local framework that might apply legally for the different contractors or their subcontractors better in the different countries concerned.
And obviously with any NEC contract, the FM is no different. You have a choice of governing law and a choice of language as well. So you can use that to make it specific to certain jurisdictions, though, as Ross points out, if it's across jurisdictions, then that may need greater consideration. Okay, another question that's come through, maybe one for you, Ross. What are the options for payment? Do things such as option E carry over into the FMC?
Yes, perhaps I should have said that. We have the same three options for payment that we've seen in so many of the NEC contracts where there's a price-based option A, which is essentially a price against a price list. The client specifies what they want, and the service provider is pricing that up. There is a option E, cost reimbursable, where effectively the contractor is paid for the work they do against what the contract calls defined cost, if you like, what is the actual cost to the contractor, to the service provider. My apologies, I can so easily slip into the wrong language as well. The service provider will be paid effectively for what they do with an uplift for their profitability on it. And then there's a target based, which I have to say is much more complicated to run often for a term contract than it is for a project contract, because of the very nature of a FM term contract. You're never quite sure what the end figure is going to be at the beginning because of the nature of the call off work in it, but the same three options apply.
Yeah, there is a real interest in FM around the pain gain share aspect, and I think that's definitely an area when we come to perhaps provide a bit of supporting information and guidance in the future. That's an area we want to explore a bit more, because again, I think that helps underpin the sort of joint approach to delivery of service, to the balance of risk as well as the cost. So certainly an area that we need a bit more work in terms of explaining how that can work.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question regarding inspections. I'm not quite sure if I maybe understand the question fully, but I think it's relating to issues around undertaking inspections of existing assets or of work. Who would undertake that? Is that the client or the service provider, or is there flexibility around sort of who does what in terms of inspections or other activities under the contract? Ross?
Yes, if I start with, if by that question, which I think it's saying is, we've got, as we often do have with these contracts, a certain degree of uncertainty as to the asset that the client actually has, or that the service provider is actually being asked to look after. Essentially, this lies with where the parties want to place it. Generally speaking, hopefully, the client has a fairly clear idea of what it is that they want looking after. And the service provider, particularly if it's a price-based contract, will price against that perceived asset register. The reality is that in many cases, service providers are asked to do an inspection or check that that asset register is right in the first months of the contract. It might be part of the mobilization process. The pricing structures are sometimes rearranged after 3 months when everybody's got to that stage. Sometimes they're then sealed at that point. Effectively, you're given 3 months to rearrange your prices to agree with the asset that you actually have got. All this is part of the process that different clients have to work out for different contracts, and would be then written into the scope of work, if that's what the question was driving at.
Thank you, Ross. Chris, anything to add?
No, I think it's Ross touches on that area that it is so often prevalent in FM contracts. It is so important in terms of preparing for the procurement process and obviously the subsequent contract to get all the information in that you can. Sounds a flippant way of putting it, but it really is. The time and effort spent then will reduce the chance of real problems later. And I think that's where the issue is, or the question was going. And that is a really key part of a successful FM contract. And Ross mentioned in his slides around the mobilisation, demobilisation periods, really key areas to get right.
If I may just pick up a point on that here, and we have actually also laid an obligation on the service provider to make sure they maintain records of everything that they do, and to pass those records through to the clients during and at the end of the contract. In other words, not only get the asset registers, if that's what you're talking about, correct at the beginning, but to maintain them so that we know what has been done, we know what work has been done, so that gives a good indication of the state of our total asset, but also have that information provided in a complete form to the client at all times.
Okay, thank you. Chris, maybe one for you here. Question is, do you expect NHS Trust to use these contracts after handback of PFI contracts?
Yeah, so I would certainly hope that they would. lots of work going on in that space now as to what's going to happen next, as to where the service delivery should sit. Should it be taken back in-house? Should it be delivered as an extension of what the existing arrangements are? Should we have a new form of FM service delivery in that space? And I think a lot of work is ongoing. I know NHSIE is doing some quite extensive preparatory work in that space. Do I think NEC could be used? Perhaps if I could just sort of change the question slightly. Absolutely, in terms of how the benefits of how NEC can support both parties in the delivery of the contract, I think is something that should be considered by NHS trusts. And I know that there is perhaps if I may, it might be a little bit of a loaded question in terms that some trusts have moved away from it. I don't think actually, and I'll stick my neck out here, I don't think that is around NEC per se. I think that is around the understanding of how to use it. And I know that can be a bit inflammatory, but that's my experience in terms of the expertise, the knowledge, the training that's needed, and perhaps the ongoing support as well to the use of NEC. We know that the form of contract, we recognise the form of contract is relatively labour intensive in the fact that it promotes good management practice, but that means that people have to do the management of the contract, the work that's needed through the various processes that it needs. But we think that's only a good thing. We don't think it needs to be a burden as such, and we think that hands-on focus should be producing the right behaviours and attitudes and dealing with things before they come up, as we've seen before. So short answer is yes, I believe it is an appropriate form of contract.
Thank you. Ross, maybe a question for yourself here. What will the recommended value thresholds be for the shorter contracts? So when to use the short contract as opposed to the full contract?
Oh, this is a sort of a perpetual question. In one sense, I don't think there is a financial limit. It's often a risk limit, in the sense that the short forms are designed to be used for contracts that are price-based. So in a sense, that gives you a particular approach. If you want to use a cost-based contract, you wouldn't use a short form. But they're designed to be price-based contracts where the degree of complexity is reduced. So in theory, they could be very high value but very low risk contracts. In practice, they'll tend to be lower values. I mean, I would say that, interestingly, one of the things I've just been working with a client recently who's using the short form of term contract. They're actually using the TSC short form, but they're using it for relatively low value but important pieces of work for them, because they realise that within the small and medium-sized enterprise sector, the SME sector, they didn't want to sort of frighten them off with a very complex big contract. So the value to them has been in having a contract which is not, if you like, something that frightens people off because they've never seen anything of this sort of size, but it's still a structured, properly managed contract which can be used by them by the same teams in this client organisation that is using the bigger contracts for much more complex work. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Chris, maybe one for yourself, or initially for yourself to respond on, about market engagement and what market engagement has been undertaken in preparing the contracts in terms of engagement with the supply chain, and particularly around SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah, really good question. So the steering group that I was a member of consisted of members across the spectrum in terms of public and private organisations. So there was some representation there. In terms of testing it, the way in which the engagement has been undertaken is something that IWFM have supported. So there has been some engagement with how could the particular issues we were discussing at the time as the contract was being developed, how could they work? What were the challenges? What were the issues? It's not been put out for consultation as such, but there has been a lot of interaction with various industry colleagues as we've developed the contract. It's also important to say that for the next 6 months or so, ahead of summer, before the publication of the hard copy, we welcome feedback from people who can get hold of it, get hold of the copy that will be available, the digital copy, the e-copy, and comments and feedback will be welcome on that. Early adopters as well, in terms of the response to what they see. So we do welcome that, but it has had a level of engagement as it's been developed because of the people that have been involved and some of the testing around some of the issues that have come up as we've developed it.
Okay, thank you for that. Ross, anything to add at all?
I don't think so. I mean, in one sense, yes, we've also had the experience of those who've been using the other forms of contract, which have been able to point out where they've had problems with it. So in a sense, it's not starting from something that's just suddenly come out of the ether. It's been developed out of some years of experience of FM clients who've been using this and the supply chain.
Thank you. Another question here. Maybe Ross, give us a first view on this one. Is there an exclusivity clause within the NEC4 contract? So obviously in this case, the FMC particularly.
If by that they mean, is there a clause that says the contractor is has exclusive, all the work will go to that service provider? There's nothing in the contract that specifically states exclusivity or indeed non-exclusivity. That would need to be stated by the client, independent on how they wish to allocate that. Clearly, the work, that the service that is being provided will be stated clearly in the scope. And the extent of exclusivity of that would, to be honest, in my previous work, we would have stated that as clauses at the beginning and making it a non-exclusive contract. But it's entirely up to the requests of the client.
Okay, thank you for that. Question here around international influence engagements and questioning how that applies in the main contract. So I'm guessing is how applicable is this contract to be used on an international basis and also accessing services across different geographies. I know that, Chris, you want to give us a view on that initially?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think I touched a little bit on that in the slide decks. One of the main areas of consideration that we've had as we've developed the contract is how could it be used, how will it be used across different geographies? And that's been both a positive in the sense that we've really tried to focus to make it as universally applicable as possible. And it's also caused us a few challenges in how can we make sure that what's the core body of the contract is, how the sort of sense check around making sure it is applicable everywhere. So again, I think we touched on it a few minutes ago. I strongly believe it is. I mean, we've seen that with the other forms of NEC as how that can be used across different geographies, and the FM contract will be no different for that. It will be very important to set out very clearly what the local requirements are, what the legislation, indeed you touched already around languages, what that is, and that can be clearly set out in the contract data. So I think there shouldn't be any barriers in terms of turning it the other way around. I wouldn't see there's been any barriers to international use. It will need careful preparation, but that again would be the same for any form of contract. And this particular form gives the structure to do that. So I see it as perfectly suitable to do that. Ross, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I would agree. I think I would widen the question a little bit further in one sense, is to recognise that the FM sector is almost infinitely flexible and variable. And when I was asked to try and draw up, when we were drawing up originally, the different ways that the FM sector sets out its stall, I ended up with about 16 variants, ranging from a very simple contract just to provide cleaning services, if you like, for a single client, right through to the international cross national boundaries type multi-work stream, you name it, contracts with sometimes having so in-house service providers, sometimes having just management agents working. And some of those models are actually in the user guides to explain how you would use this and how you could put it together. And that just gives you the strategy. It doesn't necessarily sort out the details of how all that international work, if it is an international one, has to be managed and dealt with. But it is possible to use a contract like this in all sorts of different areas, as long as you work through the implications.
I think interesting, maybe related to that, there's a question coming around that with all the variants in options, terminology, the contract forms, is there a danger of overcomplicating things and losing the simplicity and collaboration message? I guess it's really that balance we have to strike between giving a contract that has this inherent flexibility and yet still being able to create simple, clear processes within it. I don't know, Ross, do you want to give us a view around how you think that has been achieved or can be achieved?
Well, I think it's achieved in the sense that the contract itself is the kernel of what you want to do. And if you are moving into a highly complex area, you will need to add more information into the scope and into the ways that the contract works. As a basic core contract, it is no more complicated than any other NEC contract, which is why we've put some of the things into the option clauses, which people don't have to use if they don't want to. At its heart, it's just a straightforward contract with the basic management tools, and essentially that's what we've tried to provide. We've tried to provide something that will give a standard set of, this is the way we run a contract. So across the whole FM industry, we have a standard approach. At its simple level, the degree of how you use it is, of course, then has to be written into any contract.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Chris, do you want to add something to that?
Sorry, Ian, I was just going to say, I think, and this is probably also widening the conversation a little bit further, because I can see some comments coming up in the chat around some of the things that you would consider when you put the contract together, when you consider the scope, what are the service requirements. And I think the contract itself gives the framework to put all of that good stuff in there. It's absolutely got a home. It needs the practitioners, whoever's putting it together, to know where to put it and to understand what's the most important elements of some of those things, such as, I've just seen something come up, Daniel have asked about continuous improvement and or innovation. Absolutely, that can be in there. The extent to which you then perhaps put it into performance measurement, that also would need to be clearly understood, and the balance of risk and how that might be interpreted through the market. But it's a vehicle for doing so, and it needs people to understand what's important to the client and understand what the art of the possible is in this space. And that I think is quite important to remember as well, because FM can tick all of these boxes as long as we understand what is achievable and attainable from whoever's delivering the services that are needed.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'd also add, I think that with the NEC's modular format, the fact is you can, if you like, you only select the options you want. You don't select the options you don't want, quite obviously. And that then reduces the actual content of your final contract that should be very specific to what you want that contract to do. So whilst you have a lot of choices and maybe complexity at the start, when you're putting the contracts together, you're left with that kernel, I think it was described as, of which is the elements of the contract that you actually want to use on your particular FM service. Just mindful of time, and we're just coming towards the end of the allotted time, but there's been a few questions around the performance table, around how do you evaluate KPIs, around how that works and how it addresses things like service failures or performance and improvements to performance. And maybe Ross, if you could start off by giving us a quick overview of how that works, some of its key features, and then Chris, if you can pick up on that, thank you.
I think the performance table is clearly going to be a key document and very difficult to lay down rules of how it works, because clearly that's going to be different for everybody. I mean, you may well have a client who essentially just wants a very simple, straightforward cleaning contract, provides the service, knows what they want, might want the ability to call in the service provider to do some extra bits and pieces as and when, isn't too concerned about key performance indicators just has a very simple, straightforward service. At one end you have that, and at the other end you might have a massive performance measurement process that's put in. The key performance indicators, what it is you're measuring, what you're expecting, how you're going to measure them, who's going to measure them, what you're going to do with those figures when you've got them, is all part of that performance table. And that performance table will also then go on to specify probably the financial, but not necessarily, but obviously in many cases the financial impact of achieving or not achieving those key performance indicators, if that's the measurement and the performance measure you're using. We've already talked, or Chris has just talked about the possibility of having those being enhanced year on year, in a sense of how do we build into the efficiency of it, and that would be part of that too, I guess. So quite a lot of thinking about it. The performance table is, generally speaking, a contractual document that stands outside the scope, so it's something that the parties agree to. It can be adjusted during the lifetime of the contract by certain events. So obviously if you have a certain thing that you change the scope of the works, it may make some of the key performance indicators irrelevant, in which case you've clearly got to be able to change that table to cope with it, but that's part of the contractual approaches. So I think most people have a fairly clear idea, or many clients have a fairly clear idea what's important to them, and that is part of the emphasis and importance you put into that table.
Chris, would you like to add anything further on that?
Sure, yeah, perhaps just briefly. I mean, it is such an important area of any FM arrangement, not just in the mindset of the contract documents, but in how the parties behave towards each other. So I know from years past where I've provided work supporting companies who are bidding, one of the first things we look at, yes, you check what is it and where are things and what condition, but of course you look at those performance measures, you look at the KPIs that are in there, and you understand how can you make sure that you meet them. So a really important area. I think just to, conscious of time, just to finish off, the really important thing there is to, when you're looking at that, set out what you want to achieve through this contract and what's important to you before you start thinking about how do I then make this work within the framework of the contract. See here with NEC, because I think it can happen that people get a bit stuck in, well, how will that work within this form of contract? It can. Just set out clearly what you need to measure first, and the extent to which one thing is more important than another, and that gives you a good basis to then start to think about putting together the performance table, as Ross has spoken about.
Okay, thank you for that. We are just over time now. I think they'll maybe just squeeze one final question, because I think it is quite relevant, and then we shall answer any other questions by putting down some sort of document that captures a formal response and make that available after the session. But maybe, Ross, to yourself, a couple of comments around where does this leave the TSC, or how does this contract relate to the TSC?
Yes, I saw those.
In terms of how those fit together, do you want to give us a little bit of a view on that?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting one, and I think it's going to develop over time. We are, as the NEC is keeping the two running. Anybody who's using an existing term service contract, this doesn't make it out of date or irrelevant, because they've been running satisfactorily for years. Which do people choose in the future? I think it will depend on a number of factors. Ironically and strangely, in many ways, it may well relate to the language. If you're more comfortable with one set of language than the others, you might want to choose one or the other. I'm increasingly finding term service contracts that are being used essentially as framework type contracts, where the contract is essentially set up to use the task order process to instruct small projects, and for that the term service contract is ideal. Whereas if you've got a major sort of FM type call off situation, then the FM contract might be better for you. So I think there will be a sort of natural split on the two. Some of the procedures in the FM contract people might like, but still want to use a term contract, and we know how that can be adjusted. But I do see them running at the moment in parallel as we begin to work it out.
Okay, thank you. Chris, do you want to add anything on that before we bring things to a conclusion?
don't think I do, actually, Ian. I think, yes, it was a challenge for us when we were thinking about developing the FM, and as we did so, why would you use this rather than TSC? And I think Ross has just given a good example of where, depending on what the requirements are, you could choose one or the other. I think for the majority of FM services that are out there, particularly on the soft services perhaps side of it, if you were just doing soft services maybe, then the FM contract is the better fit. But yes, I could see that they would both run in parallel for some time, but probably nothing else to add now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I just close on that the NEC is going to listen to feedback from the users of the TSC and new users of the FMC, to see what the view is around whether we need to maintain the two versions or whether eventually we will move to one version, but really looking to the users and what the users require from the different contracts. So I'll bring things to a conclusion there. Thank you everybody for your questions and contributions. Apologies if we haven't answered all of your questions. As I said, we will do a document that provides a response to those. There is the ability to get in contact with the NEC through the users group, through the dedicated email you've seen in relation to the FM contracts. This presentation will be made available in the next day or two on the NEC website, and you can access the pre-publications of the contracts from tomorrow, either by going through the website and getting those, or through your user group contacts within the NEC. So it just leaves me to thank both Chris and Ross for their presentations and their inputs to date, and wish everybody who joins us a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.